Psalm 125 tonight. Psalm 125. Good to be back with you. We've had some weird weeks here. I was gone 2 Wednesdays ago, and then, of course, we enjoyed the Pettits last week. Thank you to those of you who came out to that. That was a sweet time. I mean, that was really a wonderful, it was high-quality music, and I was very thankful. I was telling our staff, Steve's changed a lot, I think. Dr. Pettit has changed a lot. He's Steve to me, but, he's an evangelist. And one thing evangelists don't like to do is change their sermon like in real time. They don't like, especially when it comes to cutting it short. And so we had a miscommunicado, all right? The music guy said, "How long were you thinking?" And I said, "An hour." And he thought I meant an hour of music. So we had an hour of music, which is why if you were here, you noticed Steve didn't start preaching until 7:55. And I'm going, this is going to be a long night. Because I know Brother Steve. And anyway, I was thankful that he read the room, and it was more like a challenge, right? But it was what a wonderful message from John's gospel. And anyway, it was a great time last week. Thank you to those who could make it. Psalm 125. So 2 weeks ago, I do not often, actually, I never, I'll put it that way, because I think it's true. I never plan messages involving a story, okay? If I tell a story in my message, it is organically grown out of the message, not the other way around. You know how sometimes you can tell people really just itching to tell a story, right? I really don't do that because, personal stories really don't do anything for you except maybe make you happy or sad, I guess. But I have a story from 2 weeks ago that actually works perfectly for tonight. And have you ever faced the situation where you found yourself really hoping that what you were doing was worth it? The effort that you were putting in, maybe the money that you had spent, the exertion, maybe mental or physical, you were really hoping that it was worth it. Well, 2 weeks ago, so if you don't know where my wife and I went away for a few days a few weeks ago. My Father's Day gift was a trip to my home stomping grounds. We went to Atlanta, went to a Braves game, just had a great few nights away. And so we met some friends there, met some of our best friends there, and so we were out in they call it the Battery, outside of the Atlanta, the Truist Park, the Braves Stadium. Just a bunch of restaurants and shopping. It's a really nice area. We were just out hanging out, and this lady comes up, and she says, just want to know, to my friend and myself, if you would be interested in doing one of the in-between inning activities tonight. So if you don't know what that means, if you go to a baseball game, they have like little funny games in between the innings, and sometimes they're on the screen and sometimes they're on the field, right? And so I did not. This is not like me. I just grabbed the clipboard from her and started signing my name. And then I said, "Wait a second, what am I signing?" And she said, "That's a waiver." And I said, "Okay, so what am I doing, right?" She said, "Well, this would be like you'd actually get to be on the field, and it would be after the 5th inning, and you would run a little obstacle course out on the warning track area." And I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." So I started signing my name, and I said, "Wait a second, what do I get for this?" And she said, "Well, you win $100 if you win." It's like, man, I don't know if that's worth it. She said, "Well, you would get to be on the field." And I said, "That's worth it." So I did the little thing, signed the waiver, and it was actually really fun. So I got out there, and I had to get ready. It was so I had to start on one foul pole and run all the way to the other foul pole, and I had to climb over a 10-foot wall and run through the little, like paper stuff that you have to run through if you're trying to burst through paper, whatever that stuff's called. And I had to crawl through a tube, and the only thing that I could explain that with, like those dog shows where they make the I felt like a dog crawling through this tube. And I did do it, and I won the $100. And so it was fun. The real value of it was just the memory, though, and getting to be on the stadium with the field of the team that I love, and it was a really wonderful time. Got to sit out basically in the bullpen and watch the game for 2 innings. Those were pretty good seats, right? And at one point, I'm getting ready. I'm amping myself up, and Julia goes, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "Honey, there's 50,000 people watching me." And I said, "The only people who get famous for doing these things are the people who fall on their face and make an idiot out of themselves," right? So anyway, it was a great time. It was fun. But I did find myself asking, especially I was walking out there and I'm putting on this protective gear, because they don't want you falling off the 10-foot wall and suing them. Is this really going to be worth it? Especially if I trip and fall on my face and humiliate myself. It was worth it in the end. Have you ever gone through a spiritual trial so deep and so painful and just really hoped in the end it was worth the pain? Have you ever seen your loved ones suffer, and the only thing you knew to say to them is that God has a purpose? For some reason, it'll make sense. And you were just hoping, you were banking on the reality that it's worth it. I think any honest Christian who's lived life would say, yeah, they've been there. They've had to ask themselves, and maybe even ask God, is this really going to be worth what we're going through here? And the psalmist is going to tap into that idea in Psalm 125. This is a very short psalm, one of the most concise of the Ascent texts. There's some argument as to whether or not this should be a psalm of ascent. Primarily, it gets that designation because of its focus on the mountains. And so you can get the idea that they're singing these songs as they are approaching these iconic mountains surrounding Jerusalem. Let's read the psalm. Psalm 125, a song of ascents. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. For the scepter of wickedness shall not rest in the land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. Do good, O Lord, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. But to those who turn aside to their crooked ways, the Lord will lead away with evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. Let's pray. We'll work through this psalm together. Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you that it never fails. We're thankful that it answers the deepest questions of our hearts. And this is one of the reasons that I love the Psalms. I think that we need the Psalms, is that it gives us a place to go with the questions that are hard to ask. And it provides true answers, meaningful answers, foundational answers. And so I pray that you'd help us to be assured that walking in the way of righteousness is always worth it. And I ask these things through Christ. Amen. Well, the psalmist here is struggling because he's looking at the nations who have brought unrighteousness into Israel. There's a number of there's two primary ways to look at this passage. One is that what I just said to you, the psalmist is imploring the people of Israel. He's calling the people of Israel to stay faithful, that the Lord's peace would be upon them, that they would not go the way of the unrighteous. And that tends to be how I translate the psalm. The other idea is just that this is essentially a a prayer on the behalf of the people. However, I think that there actually is some tension in the passage. And the reason I think that there's tension in the passage is because of verse 1. Those who trust in the Lord. And in what moments of your life do you need trust? Well, it's the times in your life when there's difficulty. Or to use the word I just used, tension. And so the tension here is, are we gonna stay faithful, or are we going to continue this scepter of wickedness that shall not rest on the land? Because, of course, you know that there was a time in Israel when they went the way of the wicked. And so I tend to think that this is the psalmist imploring the people to stay faithful, to not go back into this cycle that Israel seemingly finds themselves constantly in. I want you to note first with me the source of trust and stability, or the symbol of trust and stability, the source and symbol of stability. The source and symbol of stability. Well, what's the source and symbol? Well, the source of stability is trust. Those who trust in the Lord. And then we're given a symbol, are like Mount Zion. So the source of stability is trust. The symbol is this mountain, this well-loved mountain, the Mount of David, the Mount of God's presence, the Mount of holiness, the Mount of future. Remember, as we've talked about Zion throughout the Psalms, there's so many aspects to this idea of Mount Zion. Those who trust in the Lord, that is, they have their confidence in the Lord, they're resting in the Lord, they've placed the assurance of their soul in the Lord, are like Mount Zion. And this is why the psalm is considered typically an ascent psalm, because you can almost visualize them singing this as they're approaching the mountains surrounding the city. Like maybe even as they get close to Zion. Those who trust in the Lord are like that mountain, that one right there. And of course you understand the idea, the imagery. Unwavering, founded, rooted, strong. Not going to topple over when some wind comes. Not going to be pressed when difficulty presses upon it. Stability. So how is this kind of stability possible, especially when we live in a world as we're surrounded in life by instability, by insecurity, by things that cause us instability and insecurity, that do cause us to waver or tempt us to sin or to discouragement or to give up or to quit or to fail. Those who trust in the Lord. And again, we're brought back to this simple concept and at times seemingly possible practice of trust. And I do think the reason it's so difficult for us is because there are a certain number of vulnerabilities involved in trust. You have to lose control. I mean, it's the resignation that you never really had it. You have to understand every insufficiency about yourself to trust. Insufficiency of knowledge, insufficiency of strength, insufficiency of wisdom, insufficiency of discipline, insufficiency of, we go down the list. It is the resignation that you never had control. It is the resignation of your own, the agreement of your own insufficiency when we trust. It's filling the void between the ways of God. As high as the heavens are from the earth, so are God's ways higher than our ways, and our lack of ability to understand Him, our lacking capacity to grapple with Him. What fills all of that void? It has to be trust. Otherwise, we will attempt to quantify everything and control everything and reason out everything and resolve everything. Trust is perhaps the most simple command in the Scriptures from an understanding perspective, yet scarily difficult to exercise. And you certainly understand it in your human relationships. Maybe you were formed and developed in a family life where trust only ever caused you pain. If you trusted someone, you were going to get hurt, and so you quit. If you trusted maybe someone outside your family, it was going to bite you, so you quit. And then what we do as humans, because of the way that we're formed and developed in our emotions and in our mentality, and especially when we're young, is we accidentally, or even without realizing it, begin to impose all of those human limitations and human pains and human injustices on God. And we think, since trust has only ever brought me pain, then I certainly can't give it to God. Yet, as we live our life as Christians, it's the continual reminder that if we place our trust anywhere but on God, it will only bring us pain. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, strong, representative of peace, representative of future, representative of God's presence, representative of worship, which cannot be moved but abides forever. So we note the source and symbol of stability. So we just ask, perhaps this concept of being as stable as a mountain in the foundation of your life is so distant from you. I mean, you're like a blade of grass, just flicking in the wind. There's no stability to your life. And if that's the case, you really have to ask yourself the question, where is your trust? Or who are you trusting? Or in what about yourself are you trusting? Or whose bank account are you trusting? Or what medication are you trusting? You get my point. Because all sources of trust and dependence are insufficient save Christ. The sovereignty of God, the sealing of the Spirit, the security of the gospel. And then the psalmist is going to move to the protection that is available to God, namely, if Israel remains faithful. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. And you can see, sometimes the poetry in the Psalms is kind of enigmatic, and you really have to figure out what the imagery here. The imagery might be, but it's not that case here. I mean, this is such a beautiful, powerful image for God surrounding his people with protection. It's like if the city, truly, because that's what the psalmist is tapping into, surrounded by mountains, is not only protected by the walls that they are to build or human means, but they're actually protected by natural things that God has made. The Lord surrounds his people. So we note a protected and preserved people, This is the idea of the mountains, keeping his people safe. Remember we talked a little bit Sunday morning about this idea that involved in the covenant is that God would keep his people safe and he would give them peace. So there's protection and there was peace if they were to maintain the law. One of the things I wish I would have said Sunday, and I hope it was implicit, it probably wasn't, is that you understand that God's relationship to his covenant is not reactionary. It's proactive, it's not reactive. He tells you what he will do, and he does it until you begin to no longer keep the covenant. So it's not like he's going to give us this testing period to see if we obey. He is going to do his thing until we disobey. And then we have lost the benefits of that covenant. So he's a promise-keeping God, and he takes the first step of that promise. So involved in this promise is this idea of protection. So they'll be protected. They'll have the eternal protection of God, for the scepter of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous. So what's the land allotted to the righteous? Well, this is the land that's given to those who keep the covenant, the righteous of God. The scepter, or the rule of the wicked, shall not rest on these people. This is the idea of the preservation of God's people. So we have the protection of God's people and the preservation of God's people. Involved in this protection is also the religious and moral and holiness involved in this holy preservation. The land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. How will they miss out on the protection of God and the preservation of God if the righteous stretch out their hand to do wrong? So there is a time, and you see it over and over and over again in Israel's history, where the scepter of the wicked does rest over the people. It does. Just read the Kings. I'm in the historical books in my personal time with the Lord right now. And first thing I'll just say about my own discoveries there is I don't read the Old Testament the way that I should. I love the New Testament. And usually my Old Testament reading is like, I love the prophets, and I love the Psalms, and I love the Proverbs. So I love wisdom literature, and I love the prophets. But man, we need to read history. We got to read the history. And so I have continually, these passages make much more sense. The scepter of wickedness does rest on the people at times. But what happens if they, verse 1, trust? It will not rest on them, what's the operative word? Forever. It won't. There's a remnant. There are people who desire to do right, who desire the scepter of the righteous. And how do you know these people? They trust in the Lord. Even when those around them are not, even when those around them are going the way of the idolater, they trust in the Lord, knowing that even if wickedness were to have reign over the people, if the people of God, the remnant of God, trust in the Lord, He will make it worth it. And then the psalmist moves from this idea of protection and preservation, the idea that they receive protection from the covenant, that God keeps them safe. And understand when I say that, even that's not permanently safe at this time in Israel, although that's the hope of the psalmist. And this idea of preservation, that there are people who desire to do right and therefore reject the rule of the wicked, it moves the psalmist into this prayer. It moves the psalmist into this prayer. He beckons to the Lord, do good, O Lord, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. And the doing good here, in my opinion, is the overthrowing of the scepter of the wicked. And to those who are upright in their hearts, but those who turn aside to their crooked ways, the Lord will lead away with evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. So in verses 4 and 5, we find the results of righteousness and retribution. The result, and there's two results here, the result of righteousness and the result of God's retribution. Do good to those, O Lord, who are good. Now this sounds, if you don't really have an understanding of grace and the idea of the covenant, if we don't understand Deuteronomy 7, right? I've set my love on you, then this sounds very like health and wealthy or Catholic, right? If you're good to God, He's good to you. But that's not what's going on at all here, obviously. The concept is the covenant loyalty of God, that He is good to those who are good. This is a plea for God to be who He is, not be something that He is not. We are expecting you to be good, namely to those who are good. And you and I, from the concept of grace, even understand that God is good in a way to those who are not good. He sends rain to the just and the unjust. But especially, he shows his favor to those who are his. And how do we know who are his? Well, in this psalm, we know because they trust in the Lord. And they do not turn aside to crooked ways. But those who turn aside to the crooked ways, the Lord will lead away with evil doers. Who is the acting judge in verse 5? God. Sometimes, again, we make God in our theology very it's like he's permissive of. He's allowing them to pursue the consequences of their sin. Actually, he is acting in the consequences of their sin. He is leading them down the way of their own destruction. It's what they deserve. And then peace be upon Israel. And this is such an interesting way to end this, because he's just talked about the wicked. And I believe he's talking about the wicked in Israel. I don't think he's talking about outside nations. I think it's clearly he's talking about the wicked in Israel. Why would he ask for peace? I think he's asking for peace be upon true Israel, faithful Israel, those who do good, in verse 4. Peace be upon Israel, the people of God, who are tested in their trust and who do right, who do not turn aside to the way of the crooked ways and follow after the evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. Now, I do want to make sure that we understand this from a theological perspective as we understand the entirety of the Word. What makes the psalmist confident? Well, it's his understanding of God, and we've already said that in verse 4. I think he's expecting God to do good to those who keep the covenant. And if we look at this passage and say, as they endure, or as they have endured, I'm not sure that when the psalmist is writing this, they are actually experiencing the scepter of the wicked. He might just be writing about the history of Israel when they have in the past experienced the scepter of the wicked, knowing that it was not eternal, it was but for a time, or long-standing it was for a time. Whatever the situation is, he trusts in Yahweh to be who he is, not knowing that Yahweh will finally establish a way that never again will the scepter of the wicked have final rule or even temporary rule. And that his prayer for peace would move past Israel, include other peoples, and be finalized in a time to come. And how in the world is that possible? The scepter of the wicked shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous. How is it possible that once and for all Yahweh will eradicate any reign of wickedness because because a judgment of the wicked was laid on God the Son? The pronouncement of judgment was laid on God the righteous Son. And in the receiving of that judgment, God in the new heavens and new earth will eternally lower the scepter of peace. And it is only through the Son receiving the judgment of the wicked and the penalty of the wicked And I'm in that crowd. And loved ones, so are you. It is only through the receiving of that judgment shall the reign of peace be finalized, and truly, will it be worth it? Because I am certain of one thing. If this is all that there was, it would be really hard to argue that it's worth it. Right? I mean, some of you, all of us, but some of you especially, have just been through pain after pain after pain after pain. And God offers, with passages like this, the answer to the deepest pains of your heart. That even as we dwell in a people, we are a people of uncleanness, and we dwell in a people of uncleanness. And as we attempt to navigate the unrighteousness in this world and live out righteously, but we experience those tests and we experience those pains, those questions seep in. Is this really worth it? Is God really going to make the best of this? Is this really for my good and His glory? The answer to all of those questions is found in the eternal hope that the scepter of peace will be established once and for all. And that Christ Himself has done this. And if my hope is in Him, then loyalty to God is worth it. Loyalty to God is worth it. Trusting in God is worth it. And this spans from the checkbook is tough right now. The work is not coming in. They cut my hours again, to I lost my child. What gets you through this, which is not trivial by any means, will get you through this, which seems unimaginable. That as we struggle with the temptations of our own hearts, and as we see our children, and we send off grown children to a world that is too big for them, and we know it, and they don't, what's going to get us through that? Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion. The scepter of peace will be eternally extended, not just to His subjects, but through Christ, His own. Sons and daughters of the Father, sealed by the Spirit, purchased by the Son. And so we are again back to the question, where is your trust? Because the answer to that question will dictate whether or not you believe obedience to God is worth it. That living out the life surrounded by unrighteousness faithfully, loyally to God is worth it. And so God, help our unbelief. Grow our trust. Would you pray with me?